So why are we in this building?
Yeah, well, it's a place that's really near and dear to my heart. So some personally, because my kids did all their preschool from 1 to 5 here, so it was like a 7, 8, 9 year stretch that I was in and out of this building every day. And a bunch of our sort of village is rooted here because of that. These are people who have loved our children as they were taking their first steps and all the way until they were headed into elementary school. This is also a place that is a really strong anchor in our community. So we have this amazing kind of public-private partnership that's happened here where the state has come in with a lot of funding. Frank Chop led some efforts to rehabilitate this building, keep it for public use, even though it's actually owned by a nonprofit. And in bringing that money in, bring a whole bunch of nonprofits in at a sort of rent-controlled price with the understanding and requirement that they would provide scholarships for kids who couldn't afford these daycares or couldn't afford the school down here for kids who are living on the spectrum or Broadway-bound theater, the various kinds of services out here. So I think it's just a really neat community center. It's this place that I always end up coming for various events that are important to me. And of course, we're next door at least once a week with the farmers market, and I'm on the board at the Y down here. So we do some coordinated work on human services stuff as well.
So you've been involved in the community, been here in Seattle, what, a decade now?
Yeah.
Why do you want to run for city council?
Yeah. Well, I care a lot about making this a city where people can start a career, raise a family, age in place, and I think we've got too many barriers in place now. So I have a lot of passion around this topic because my parents were teenagers when they got pregnant with me, both working in a diner. Dad quit his job, went actually down to minimum wage to get a job at a factory to pay, because he needed benefits, right? And they worked their butts off. But at that time, housing was more affordable. So a few years later, as I was moving toward more like 10, and he was still working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, but they were able to get a toehold in the middle class because they were able to buy a house. And that path is really closed for people today, and especially in a city like Seattle. So Seattle's unaffordability bothers me deeply, and I've been working as a volunteer on the edge trying to improve the community, trying to improve access, trying to improve affordability. And I feel like we've been talking about things like homelessness crises and housing price crises for years, and we do not have the pep in our step that we need. And so I decided to come off the sidelines and see if I could make a difference.
Harvard Law, did I hear this right?
I did go to Harvard Law School, yeah. I did graduate from Harvard Law School, I should say that. I went and they kept me there for 3 years, yeah.
Smart guy, tech industry, I mean, you don't necessarily need to do this, do you?
Definitely not. No, this is obviously not the smartest economic decision I've ever made or a personal life decision, right? You give up your privacy and you sort of automatically, no matter what you do, are going to have half your neighbors not feel very positively about you. And so I think you either have to be delusional about what the job is, which I really hope I'm not, or you have to care deeply about the issues that the council actually works on. And in this case, for me, it's particularly housing, homelessness, transportation, which is deeply related to our climate challenges, and of course, public safety, and really a broad view of public safety. Like this is my community. I'm passionate about it. It's time for me to give back. I've been very, very lucky. And I recognize that luck has played such a big role for me, and we've engineered things so that people essentially need to pull a lottery ticket to make it now, and that's just not okay.
3 port commissioners have endorsed you, and people pay attention to endorsements. Councilmember from King County, Gurmai Zahalai, has endorsed you as well. What are people supposed to read from that?
Yeah, I mean, a bunch more too. Teresa Mosqueda, our city council, citywide city councilor, Daria Farvar, our 46 Dems, Representative Nicole Macri, 43rd. So other, very popular folks, and it's been a mix of, like you mentioned, the port, right? Sam Cho's maybe a more centrist person. I've got a number of folks from the business community, all the way to more, profoundly progressive folks like Gurmai Zahalai. I think this is a set of people who knows me, knows the work I've been doing, knows my skill, knows my passion, and knows that I understand policy top to bottom and how to take the incremental steps to actually get us where we need to go.
So let's go through some of those policies, because I've seen on your platform, on your website, you've talked about the need to fully fund social services, fully fund behavioral health. On the second point, I think a lot of people would agree with you, but the big question is how?
Yeah, great question. So I've also published a plan in The Stranger that is arguing for the constitutionality of a number of potential progressive taxes that we could do that would allow us to both cover the upcoming budget gap and do, as I say, fully fund this. So the how involves some things like tweaking with Jumpstart, using Alex Peterson's top-up of the extreme capital gains tax, although not using his offset of water bills, but actually using that to fund social services. And I've actually presented a de facto progressive, but technically statutorily flat version of an income tax that I've spoken with constitutional scholars and they think would be very much passable with our Supreme Court. And I could get way into the weeds on that. I'm happy to take you offline and walk you through it, and if you want it, but like it's not going to be fun listening, talking about statutory interpretation, but I will say we have the means to do this. As the most upside down tax jurisdiction in the country, we also have the space to do this without killing the golden goose, without driving our businesses out. And as somebody who was also a student of economics, we also have the luxury of 300 peer-reviewed studies of local variances in tax regimes. And we know that basically the kinds of things we're talking about don't hurt GDP, job growth, migration, or startup creation, according to the best academics in the world, the Federal Reserve, and think tanks that are all looking at this. So,
well, that the business community in particular cringed at the head tax. Then the jumpstart tax was approved during the pandemic. Yeah. Now the mayor is dipping into that for other issues. I mean, when you suggest adding on to the jumpstart tax, how do you do that without scaring off more in the business community?
Well, two things. One is I'm much more interested in facts than in sort of the theatrics, right? So one is I know a ton of folks in the business community who are completely fine with this, right? There are a few 800-pound gorillas that would really like to have an infinitely more favorable. They would like their taxes to go to zero, and their job is to fight to try to keep it from going to zero, or to try to keep it, pushing it towards zero, right? So for me, when a few people who are paid lobbyists for an industry say, oh, it's going to make our industry fail, and I have something like 300 peer-reviewed studies, I'm going to pay attention to facts, and I'm going to pay attention to what's sensible. I'm not going to pay attention to what a hired gun says is going to happen, right? It's their job to tell me that anytime I do anything that moves us from the most upside down tax regime to the 49th in the country to the 49th most upside down tax regime, that will somehow kill the golden goose, even though many of our other states are doing just fine, or that the Federal Reserve and all these folks have no idea how actual local business behaves when we have thousands and thousands of data points. It's not credible when the fact that a few loud people are saying it's going to happen is really not predictive, right? Just like a few loud people said ivermectin cured COVID, I'm much more interested in actual science. And they did, right? They said it and they believed it. I know people that believe essential oils will fix cancer and all kinds of crazy things. And the truth is sometimes, a person takes ivermectin and they happen to get better from COVID, and they put two and two together, and I think they believe it genuinely. But this is why we invented science 300 years ago.
Apologies for laughing. I just wasn't expecting you to connect the jumpstart tax to ivermectin and essential oils.
Opposition to the jumpstart tax. I'm connecting it.
I
do. Can I add one more place?
Yeah.
I really do think it's important to also recognize that both that the business community is actually divided about this, and that I forgot to say I said there's no economic effect. One is there is actually one. I forgot. It's those tax variances. The only economic they have effect is on inequality. So if there is an effect, it just happens to be a negative one. The other is, I do think it's also important, while I'm fine to push back on a few lobbyists telling a just so story to get their way and line shareholders' pockets and raise the price of their share by a half a penny, I also think we have made a mistake as progressives at times demonizing business overall. I think I'm, as a former CEO myself, as somebody who's constantly talking to small businesses and big businesses, who's meeting with the folks working on tourism, who are working in real estate, I want this place to thrive. I'm just rigorously empirical about it. I'm not just going to hook, line, and sinker swallow the story a lobbyist gives me. That's all.
So homelessness, I think you have called it your top issue. Your lowest priority, according to the Seattle Times, was economic development and cleaner streets. Aren't those issues connected?
Great question. So the way you stack rank something and what policies the city can actually pursue are related. But no, actually, often the richest cities have the highest rates of homelessness. So you can continue to do economic development, and we should. I just actually happen to think that's something we do pretty well. This is why we're the third or fourth richest city in the country, and one of the richest cities in the history of human civilization. So while I think economic development is extremely important, when I look at where do we have a crisis, we have a crisis with thousands and thousands of people living in squalor and in danger on our streets, compromising their safety and our public spaces, right? And so to me, that is a higher related issue. And this is another one where we have the wonderful benefit of being able to learn from other communities and decades of peer-reviewed research on what actually works and what doesn't. And we know that what works is the three-legged supply subsidy stability stool. So I can get into the details about that.
Well, I would ask you this, and I'm asking everybody the same question.
Yeah.
I've heard all the ideas for homelessness,
These are battle-tested empirical things, not ideas.
Going back a decade. So what's your big idea for solving the homelessness
See, that's
crisis?
the thing. Homelessness is a wicked problem. There is no one big idea. And the folks that have been peddling one big idea are the reason that we got into this space. So this is part of, you said at the beginning, you pointed out sort of my nerdiness, and that matters to me, right? And as I talk to Seattle voters, most people understand this is a wicked, complicated problem. They know that it's a mix of bending the cost curve on supply for upper income and middle income housing. They know that it's making it cheaper to build affordable housing, aggressively investing in that affordable housing, and also being practical and building things like tiny homes, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And they know that it's about making sure that we're thoughtful as we protect renters, especially identifying those who are likely to fall into homelessness, and doing things like offering direct assistance to ensure that, because an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure.
On your website, you also had a line, stop homelessness before it starts.
That last line relates to it, right? So we have a pretty good sense of the factors. We have a good sense of the factors city by city that drive homelessness, but in our city we also have a pretty good sense of who is likely to fall into homelessness, and there is some pretty good data that we are able to provide things like direct rental assistance once we identify somebody who's starting to get other services. It looks like they're in duress and likely to fall into it, and so things like direct rental assistance programs, with potentially, say if there's a behavioral health issue, some of these other supports are much more affordable, frankly, than trying to peel someone off the street after they've been out there, after they've been exposed, after they've potentially been hooked on toxic substances. It's a much harder problem.
So I want to talk about public safety, which you labeled as your third priority. I'm hoping you can define this one for me that I read straight off your website.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read it. Real safety means we ensure stable housing for those on the streets, we don't force people into concentrated poverty, and we tailor the right response for the right crisis instead of a one-size-fits-all fundamentalism we see from the right. What does that mean?
That's a fair question, right? So we can get into the specifics. So one is, my first part of the sentence is really focusing on the ways that we breed crime, right? Right now we tend to have very segregated neighborhoods. When we do something like affordable housing, and we link, say, MHA funding, we don't often keep it in neighborhood. We export it to neighborhoods that are already poor. We reinforce patterns of segregation along things like busy arterials. We know that economic and racial segregation, and especially concentrations of poverty, actually breeds more criminal behavior. We don't want that, right? And so more economically integrated neighborhoods matter. Now, we also have to deal with our acute crises. So I also mentioned this one-size-fits-all response. And this is a reference to the fact that in almost every discipline in the world, we have specialized. We have said, okay, there's a set of things that I'm really good at, I'm good at planning the product, but I'm not good at building it. So we've separated product management from engineering. But I'm not really great at figuring out what users need. So we've got a user experience designer, right, to come from the tech world. In our public safety crisis space, we know that we could automate traffic enforcement pretty much overnight with camera enforcement, with some basic civil liberties safeguards. We know that our citizens have been calling for us to stand up and scale a behavioral health crisis response. We know that police are probably absolutely the best equipped to deal with violent crime or situations where people are armed, right, where we want somebody armed and ready to come in. And so it's time for us to actually specialize and do what Seattle's been asking for, right, which is to fund both the police department and behavioral health and do things like camera enforcement to pull stuff off the police's plate, because as we know, they're very oversubscribed and unable to respond to a lot of calls right now.
Homicide rates are up, violent crimes up, cop levels have been down, response times are down. Do you think there needs to be more cops on the streets?
Yeah, of course. Right now we're down 367 officers. Last I checked, the number may have changed, which is about 27% of our workforce. One of the challenges here is we have to, stay in realism, not fantasy about it. So here's where I really differ with my opponent. So when we look at 85% of jurisdictions in Washington state are off their hiring targets. Many have described it as a crisis. It is worse here than elsewhere. But other big cities also have it, usually the worst in their state. And there are red cities that have it as bad as we do. Memphis, Tulsa, Fulton County, which is suburban Atlanta, they're all off 20, 25, 27%. This is not just a Seattle problem. after 2020, hundreds of thousands of people left the discipline of policing, right? And so now we have this national hiring shortage. So we're down 367. We have to figure out what to do. So one of the things we should do is we should fully staff the staffable positions. But we also have to listen to what the actual police department has said. And they have said, given this hiring market, even with hiring bonuses and upping salaries and doing marketing and magic, we're going to get 15 to 30 new officers. So I think it's irresponsible and magical promises when we have people running around talking about generating 12 to 24 times that. That would be like me saying my homelessness plan is to lower interest rates and the cost of lumber. So where I live in the business world, if that's your plan, you get fired. And so I think as we go into this, we need to both, yes, staff the positions we can and be realistic about what's possible. And so given what is realistic, given that SPD says 15 to 30 positions net growth best case next year, we need to do our very best to meet and exceed that, but we also need to have a plan to work, essentially as the Amazon people say, right? We need to work backwards. We want fast response times, well then we gotta get some of the stuff off these guys' plates, right? And so that is things like behavioral health. 12%, SPD did a study of its own calls and said 12% of these calls could be triaged directly to a behavioral health only team, right? That's 12% of the 27%. An independent audit came in and put the number higher. Obviously, camera enforcement is another opportunity there. Not requiring police officers to be present at the administration of Narcan. There's a lot of opportunities here to both staff the department and build up alternates so that we can all be safe.
The mayor has said recently applications are at a 2-year high. Again, to your point, probably can't hire anybody fast enough, even if they go through all the checks and the training and everything. So if you're elected, you're gonna be in a point where you potentially could be asked to fund the police department. You'll also be able to weigh in on the next guild contract. So what do you want to see in the guild contract?
Great question, Chris. One of the things is that I'm going to let the person remain nameless, but I was speaking to a state senator yesterday who has worked with guilds all over this state, and has said, many of them are, their contracts are updating to have real accountability measures. They're not getting themselves under the thumb of the Justice Department. We have a real challenge with some leadership at SPOG that's made it very, very difficult, and has since long before 2020, right? So what do I want to see in this contract? I want to see basic good governance, and I'll be specific about what that means. So as a former CEO, I had a boss, and that was a board, right? Every CEO should have a board. The president has Congress. The Congress can fire them. The military has the president and the Department of Defense. In a democracy, when we don't have a boss, that's a bad thing. And when we arm people and we don't give them a boss, that's a bad thing. So how do we give the police really a boss, right? How do we really get accountability right? Which Judge Robart has recently said we've not done. I think the folks that are working in police reform around the country and seeing success in other departments are saying it's generally independent oversight with no conflict of interest, which means none of your buddies are on the commission doing the oversight because their incentives are mixed. With full transparency, and transparency is achieved through subpoena power so that nobody can slow walk information, and the ability to discipline. If we had just that in place, which is what every person with a boss has, we would be able to root out the bad apples when people talk about bad apples, and B, I think we'd start to actually regain the confidence of the community and also start to release some of the siege mentality that makes it maybe even extra hard to recruit here. And particularly extra hard to recruit people from this community or from communities that have experienced inequitable policing. We talk a lot about wanting to get them in to SPD to change the culture, but we also you can change the culture from the bottom up, but you also have to do the work from the top down. And so that's the kind of stuff that's important to me to see in the SPOG contract.
And if all of that happens and you get a new contract, you're elected, you approve a new contract, can you see a day when you would back adding more police officers to cut down on those response times?
Yeah, the current budget backs that, and I supported the current budget. So yes, absolutely. I think the key here is not to live in fantasy land and lie to voters about what we can do. I think that voters are smarter than that, and I think that's wrong, and I think we're continuing, it's big ideas that aren't rooted in reality and practicality that have gotten us into this mess, and we don't need more of that crap.
You and your opponent like to throw around the word fantasy land a lot. She threw that at you in regards to the drug possession bill and sent out a press release about a tweet
I saw
that you had said that you didn't want to prosecute drug dealers. Is that accurate?
No, I said I wanted to amend a previous statement that was about prosecution to add diversion, which is something that I said after discussing with folks working closely with the mayor, who have said basically a substantial number of street level dealers are actually subsistence level and their real problem is addiction rather than like I'm making a ton of money off of this. And so it turns out that when we throw them in jail and they end up back on the street, they're just dealing again. And so, hey, we'd love it if you'd come out in support of diversion as well in those cases. Diversion is often post-arrest, right? So the idea that somehow that I'm anti-enforcement was just completely made up.
But you didn't like the drug possession law?
You know, I think my feelings about the drug possession law are really going to depend on its execution at this point. So I think the critics of the law say, you know, it's going to reignite the drug war. And the boosters are like, no, it's the path to getting people into treatment. And reality is that we don't have a whole lot of jail space or treatment capacity. And so it will really depend on what we build and deliver and how tightly the guidelines are written by the mayor to the police department and how well they follow those. So my feelings about the drug law will be determined by what comes next, which is what my eyes are on. So, I would also note that my drug plan is exactly in line with the Biden administration, what the Cato Institute on the right advocates for, the World Health Organization, the American Association of Addiction Medicine, the UN, the Red Cross. So for Maritza Rivera to call that fantastical suggests she's wildly out of touch with reality and has extremist views.
What is your plan? Because obviously the fentanyl crisis is raging.
Terrible.
Not only in Seattle, but on the West Coast and throughout the country.
Yeah, it's brutal. So my plan is a few things. So one is, you know, right now we know that programming like LEAD is really effective, whether that comes through community referrals, police referrals, pre-arrest because of relationships police provide, and post-arrest diversion when it's identified that people's actual problem is addiction. So whatever our interactions with the community are, whether they include arrest or not, if addiction is the problem, we need to move people into evidence-based programming like LEAD, which is the only thing so far that's been shown to actually get people to clean up. So as a friend of mine says, and you may hear this in an interview later, you know, jail is the platinum plan that doesn't work, right? If jail worked, I mean, I lost a friend to addiction. If jail had worked, I would have drug his ass there myself. And his 3 children now don't have a father. But the truth is, this is again one of those places where the science is really clear. So one, I do think we need to be taking a public health approach, which also tends to remove the racial disparities we've seen in over-policing the issue. 2, I have said I actually not only think we should be moving people into diversion when they are a risk to others or dealing, but also actually I'm okay with prohibiting public consumption as long as we provide reasonable alternates for folks who live on the street. Because when you live on the street, there's no other place to consume and people can't just decide to quit fentanyl. If they could, they wouldn't be losing their lives over it. And so, you know, in New York, centrist cop Eric Adams has put in overdose prevention centers and said basically like you can move inside or you can get prosecuted, and people move inside. And it turns out the death rates in those situations are near zero. The neighborhood cleans up, the needles are gone, and safety increases, and those places become propaganda centers to move people into treatment. So that's really effective. So I actually, you know, and this is why, by the way, all the folks who are actually focused on not who are like, I care so much about public safety, but who actually spend their lives advocating for it. So whether that's like the Moms Against Gun Violence folks or the Alliance for Gun Responsibility or the transit operators who are scared to death of driving their buses, this is why they're all out endorsing me or giving me their seal of approval and not giving my opponent this, because I'm actually pursuing evidence-based practice.
You want to kickstart safe consumption discussion again?
I mean, we already passed it as a discussion, right?
Right,
it's
but
it's just a matter of execution, right?
It's
I mean,
kind of just
it's
died on the vine.
It's one part of a plan, right? The largest amount of our resources should be going toward treatment, but we also have serious capacity issues in treatment, and if we want unsafe consumption, if we want to stop unsafe consumption on our doorsteps, there is no jail capacity, there is no treatment capacity. We can either put people into an overdose prevention framework that's more likely to push them into treatment, or we can just cycle them in and out of our 3 spots in jail when there's thousands on the streets, so it's not going to do anything to clean things up, and they'll be back on the streets 5 minutes later. I just want to be practical.
We've covered a lot of stuff. I'd like to end with this. You're a dad, you're somebody who cares about your community. That's why you're running for office. If you get elected, what do you think this city looks like in 4 years? at the end of that term?
Well, I don't have the delusions of grandeur to think that simply just me being elected will change the tenor. So it will really depend on my colleagues, who's elected, what their attitude is, what their goals are. And I will say, as a professional deal maker, of course, and as somebody who is self-assured enough to think that they should run for office, of course, I do hope to make a difference. For me, we will be doing what places like Minneapolis have done, arresting the cost increases on housing, right? Market rate cost increases. We will be more progressively funding affordable housing instead of nickel and diming older folks on fixed incomes by making all of our affordable housing funding come from property taxes. And we will have funded and delivered the treatment and housing necessary to get people who are living in squalor into shelter and out of addiction. Those are my key goals, right? I also have some longer term goals, right? I don't know if it's 4 years from now, it'll take a little longer than 4 years, but I am aiming to make it as easy, safe, convenient, and reliable to get around the city without a car as it is with, because we know that is a key pillar of both a better climate policy, also just a friendlier place to live, better livability, and it is much better for things like aging in place and for children.
Well, Ron, thanks for sitting down with me in a beautiful, historic
I'm so glad you came.
Seattle building.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it, Chris.